Memory is a fickle thing that can be manipulated, and sometimes we do it to ourselves.
Would you like to know more?
Since I've talked about Starship Troopers in a previous video, I've had several people both here in the comments and elsewhere remind me that the book has other ways to become a citizen besides military service. I did not remember this being the case, so I read through it again, focused on the question, is military service the only way to become a citizen of the Terran Federation? Short answer, yes, but it's more interesting than that. Let's follow our guide, Johnny Rico, on the quest to citizenship in the Federation. I had mentioned to my father, late in my senior year in high school, that I was thinking over the idea of volunteering for federal service. The use of the term federal service seems fairly broad. In our usage, it could be anything from joining the army to being a mailman. At no point in the text does the book state that there are non-military alternatives. There are a few lines that suggest as much when taken in isolation, but the ambiguity is canceled out by things that are plainly stated elsewhere.
What's the moral difference, if any, between a civilian and a citizen?
A citizen accepts personal responsibility for the safety of the body politic, defending it with his life. A civilian does not.
The exact words of the text.
This exchange comes straight out of the book, but with one important change. What is the moral difference, if any, between the soldier and the civilian? Since this is coming from a state-mandated, or at least approved textbook, we can't attribute it to a verbal slip. The deliberate use of the term soldier instead of citizen would seem to clinch the debate right there. Unless, of course, the context of the textbook passage being quoted is narrower than the scene implies. It could be that military service is merely the most common or most respected route to citizenship. A term of service isn't a kiddie camp. It's either real military service, rough and dangerous even in peacetime, or a most unreasonable facsimile thereof. This is what the recruiting sergeant tells Johnny and his friends when they show up to enlist, or rather the anti-recruiting sergeant, the one-armed legless invalid they put out front to scare off potential enlistees. It's the closest the book comes to saying that you can be a citizen without joining the military. Because the government doesn't care one bucket of swill whether you join or not. Because it has become stylish, with some people, too many people, to serve a term and earn a franchise and be able to wear a ribbon in your lapel which says you're a veteran, whether you've ever seen combat or not. But if you want to serve and I can't talk you out of it, then we have to take you, because that's your constitutional right. It says that everybody, male or female, shall have his born right to pay his service and assume full citizenship, but the facts are that we are getting hard-pressed to find things for all the volunteers to do that aren't just glorified KP. He goes on to explain to these eager young starry-eyed mush-brained civvies that if you came in here in a wheelchair and blind in both eyes and were silly enough to insist on enrolling, they would find something silly enough to match. Counting the fuzz on a caterpillar by touch, maybe. The only way you can fail is by having the psychiatrist decide that you are not able to understand the oath. This could just be a case of sergeant's hyperbole to throw the would-be boots off balance, but let's for a moment consider it at face value. If the military is required to take everyone that wants to sign up, and as the sergeant says, too many people are enlisting and have to be accommodated with make work, then the military is upholding its social function, hardening new citizens, at the expense of its warfighting function. This suggests that the military is either the only route, or that the others, presumably not legally required to take everyone that shows up, are so small as to be almost irrelevant. It's not looking like you can become a citizen by working as a park ranger or teaching at a public school. Even the doctor conducting physicals at the recruiting station is a non-citizen. He too tries to warn them off. But military service is for ants, believe me. I see them go, I see them come back. When they come back, I see what it's done to them. And for what? A purely nominal political privilege that pays not one centavo and that most of them aren't competent to use wisely anyhow. This suggests that the nominal political privilege follows directly and solely from military service. Otherwise, the half-hearted would take other paths to it. Are there an unspecified number of coveted civil service jobs that meet the citizenship requirement? Since no specific examples are given, let's look at it conceptually. Would a society like the Federation do that? What is the purpose of requiring service to attain citizenship? What is the whole exercise supposed to accomplish? Tell him, Sergeant. So for those who insist on serving their term, but haven't got what we want and must have, We've had to think up a whole list of dirty, nasty, dangerous jobs that will either run them home with their tails between their legs and their terms uncompleted, or at the very least make them remember for the rest of their lives that their citizenship is valuable to them because they've paid a high price for it. Paid a high price. This, I think, is the key. It's not about giving the state a few years of your life in exchange for elevated status.
Why are only citizens allowed to vote?
It's a reward. What the Federation gives you for doing federal service.
No.
It's about tying the status and authority of exerting political force to real personal cost and a sense of responsibility. This takes more than a summer in the Peace Corps or a stint as a research assistant at McMurdo Station. Johnny and friends refuse to be discouraged and sign the papers, and while Carl and Carmen easily get themselves into technical fields, Johnny is not the most intellectually accomplished man to ever walk into a recruiting office.
What about you, son?
Infantry, sir.
Good for you. Mobile infantry made me the man I am today.
When it comes to listing his preference for an MOS, he stops after infantry. I didn't bother to list the various non-combatant auxiliary corps because if I wasn't picked for a combat corps, I didn't care whether they used me as an experimental animal or sent me as a laborer in the tyrannizing of Venus. Either one was a booby prize. We have to keep in mind that the military isn't just combat roles. There are cooks and truck drivers, engineers, doctors, all active duty military. The Federation has even more non-combat roles because the military is legally required to take everyone that insists on signing up. While the text doesn't explicitly say so, I have the distinct feeling that tyrannizing Venus is very much a privates with shovels job more than a typical construction gig, and probably comes with all the usual Army discipline and drudge work. I came out of the Federal building feeling subdued, yet not really unhappy. At least I was a soldier. I had papers in my pocket to prove it. I hadn't been classed as too dumb and useless for anything but make work. The Federation looks like a society that places a higher value on moral character and fortitude than on intelligence or education for its politically active class. It's selecting for people willing to sacrifice their own comfort and safety, people with the grit to stick out hardship for a greater goal. It's trying to weed out freeloaders and opportunists. They don't want to make it easy. There's no incentive to give people alternatives to military service. In fact, doing so would contradict the entire social and political philosophy of the Federation. But why does the idea that it establishes other paths take hold? What's the basis for this particular bit of headcanon? It brings to my mind the deleted Biggs Darklighter scenes from Star Wars.
Biggs! Hey! I didn't know you were back. What's again? Just now.
Over the years, I've had several people tell me that long ago they had seen Star Wars with those scenes included. One said it was on HBO, another that it was one of the networks airing it. But they didn't. No release of Star Wars included those scenes when they allegedly saw it. However, the scene was in the published script. Stills from it were widely available in various books, and NPR included it in their radio dramatization. I remembered listening to that as a kid, but I still had to look up and verify it. All the pieces were there for that particular memory to integrate itself, going from knowing what the big scenes contained, knowing where they fit in the movie, and finally that false memory of seeing Biggs Darklighter talking to Luke in some special HBO edition of Star Wars that ran once. And just as the big scene seems to have reinserted itself into the movie in the minds of some of the people exposed to it, I suppose the Starship Troopers' non-military citizenship idea persists because we live in a culture that doesn't like the idea of restricting voting rights. The Federation's logic, while internally consistent, is foreign to us. So, particularly if we like the book, our minds may insert alternatives around the bits that, taken in isolation, could suggest other options. We fill in the gaps and smooth it over. I wonder if there's a subconscious element that rejects the idea of requiring a term of service as a soldier to become a full citizen because culturally we don't trust elitism and exclusionary policies when it comes to such things. And now that less than 10% of the American population has actually served in the military, it is not a broad experience, and for most of us would translate to non-citizen status. So perhaps we shuffle things around in our minds to make it fit more with what we want and expect, In fact, that's the basis of most of modern politics, manipulating that process. Whatever the case, I do think it's clear that the Federation has one path to citizenship, and it involves talking to a crotchety sergeant that thinks you should just go home. After Starship Troopers, I went ahead and read Forever War again, so we're going to talk about that one of these days.